Okay, this is the audio review for Prisons for Our Bodies, Closets for Our Minds, Racism, Heterosexism, and Black Sexuality from Race, Class, and Gender 10th edition. Okay, so scholars have long examined the ways in which white fear of black sexuality has been a basic ingredient of racism. Colonial regimes routinely manipulated ideas about sexuality in order to maintain unjust power relations. Tracing the history of contact with English explorers and colonists in West African societies, historian Winthrop Jordan argues that English perceptions of sexual practices among African people reflected pre-existing English beliefs about blackness, religion, and animals. American historians point to the significance of sexuality in chattel slavery. Slave owners relied upon an ideology of black sexual deviance to regulate and exploit enslaved Africans. Black feminist analyses pay more attention to women's sexuality, and they too identify how the sexual exploitation of women has been a basic ingredient of racism. For example, African American slave women routinely pointed to sexual victimization as a defining feature of American slavery. Much of the literature assumes that sexuality means heterosexuality and ignores how racism and heterosexism influence one another. In the U.S., the assumption that racism and heterosexism constitute two separate systems of oppression really masks how each rely upon each other for meaning. Neither system of oppression makes sense without the other. Racism and heterosexism might be better viewed as sharing one history, with similar yet disparate effects on all Americans differentiated by race, gender, sexuality, class, and nationality. People positioned at the margins of both systems, who are harmed by both, typically raise questions about the intersections of racism and heterosexism. Also, Black womanist and Black feminist projects have challenged Black community norms of sexual double standards that punish women for behaviors in which men are equally culpable. And at the same time, Black gays and lesbians have also criticized these same sexual politics. So developing a progressive Black sexual politic requires examining how racism and heterosexism mutually construct one another. Moving on to mapping racism and heterosexism, the prison and the closet. So racism and heterosexism appear to be separate systems, but LGBT African Americans point out that both of these systems affect their everyday lives. And really, these systems affect us all, not just the most marginalized. So both the structures of racism and heterosexism use similar state-sanctioned institutional mechanisms to maintain racial and sexual hierarchies, both relying on segregating people as a mechanism of social control. And we can see this in how the state has played a very important role in sanctioning both forms of oppression, meaning laws for many years regulated where people of color could live, work, and attend school, while also at the same time laws refused to punish hate crimes and failed to protect sexual minorities from discrimination in housing, in employment, and among other realms. So racism and heterosexism share a common set of practices designed to discipline the population into accepting the status quo. So marriage is an example of this, as we can see that both interracial marriage and same-sex marriage were legally banned at some point in American history. Racism and heterosexism also manufacture ideologies that defend the status quo. They become hegemonic. Racism and heterosexism share a common cognitive framework that uses that binary thinking to produce hegemonic ideologies. So the core binary of normal or deviant becomes ground zero for justifying racism and heterosexism. Racism and heterosexism both require a concept of sexual deviancy for meaning, but the form differs. Under racism, deviance is created by normalized white heterosexuality that depends on a deviant Black heterosexuality to give it meaning. While under heterosexism, deviance is created by normalized white heterosexuality that depends on a deviant white homosexuality. For both, installing white heterosexuality as normal, natural, and ideal is compared to an assumed binary opposite. So the content of sexual deviance differs, as Black people carry the stigma of promiscuity, while LGBT people carry the stigma of rejecting heterosexuality. But really, they work together to create a sexually repressive culture in America. Historically, Western science, medicine, law, and popular culture has reduced understandings of blacks to an ideology of black sexuality, reliant on stereotypes of black promiscuity. Historically, this ideology of black sexuality has pivoted on black heterosexual promiscuity, and it really is upholding racism in gendered specific ways. So the events of the past may be over, but the effects on the culture are persistent in the new racism of today. African American women also live with these ideas about their presumed promiscuity. Contemporary social welfare policies remain preoccupied with black women's fertility. And we see the history from the past to today, as under slavery, having many children was encouraged for black women, as their children enhanced slave owners' wealth. But in the global economy of today, large families are expensive. So black women are seen as producing too many children who will take more than they contribute to society in the modern racist narrative. So we can see how the ideology shifts as the culture shifts, but the racist values and white supremacist hierarchy remains. So the reading discussed the murder of Sakia Gunn. So Sakia Gunn was only 15 years old when she was killed by a stranger while waiting for a bus with her friends in New York's Greenwich Village. And what happened was 2 men got out of a car and made sexual advances towards them and physically attacked them. So the girls fought back, and when Sakia told the men that she was a lesbian, one of the men stabbed her in the chest. So Sakia Gunn's murder illustrates the connections among class, race, gender, sexuality, and age, among others. She lacked class privilege, which left her at the bus stop. Her lack of gender privilege meant that men felt entitled to harass her for being out in public at night. She was young and therefore lacked age privilege. And she was seen as approachable as an African American woman. So Sakia and her friends challenged male authority by refusing to participate in the scripts of black promiscuity, but the catalyst to the stabbing was her openness about her lesbianism. So the reading asks, how do we separate out and weigh the various influences of class, race, age, gender, and sexuality in this particular incident? There's no easy answer, because all of these identities played some role. What's important to point out is that after her death, there was no call for hate crimes legislation, like there was after the Matthew Shepard killing, that happened only 5 years earlier. Also, black leaders and national organizations were largely silent. Her death revealed the need for new politics that takes the intersections of racism and heterosexism, as well as class exploitation, age, and all of these other factors into account. So for more information on the Sakia Gunn case, I recommend the documentary titled Dreams Deferred, the Sakia Gunn Film Project.